just share the screen and then I will start my introduction of myself and the Bridge-Building Toolbox. So hang on for a moment. Yeah, so do you all see the shared presentation? Yes. Okay, cool. Right. Yes, welcome to this talk on the Bridge-Building Toolbox for journalism. My name is Mikkel Gudsøe, or in Danish just Gudsøe. I work with the Constructive Institute in Denmark, who is based at the University of Aarhus, where I'm also an Honorary Associate Professor, not at the Constructive Institute, but at the university. So my background is legal originally. I used to be a lawyer. However, I've spent most of my professional career working with negotiation and conflict resolution. And it is on that note and on that background and my interest in the media world that I got to work with this bridge building project at Constructive Institute. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is a toolbox where we are trying to see if we can come up with some tools that journalism can use, that journalists can use in order to be able to cover conflicts in a less polarizing way and in a much more constructive manner. Now, we did consider naming it like bridge building journalism or something like that, but we actually didn't want to create a new branch. As some of the viewers here today know, we have different areas of journalism, like solution-oriented journalism and conciliatory journalism and trust journalism and constructive journalism. And so what we instead wanted to do was to, at Constructive Institute, create a toolbox that we would call Bridge-Building Toolbox, but that could be used across the various disciplines of the journalistic practice. So without further ado, I would like to head on with the Bridge-Building Toolbox. So as you know, I'm also a trained mediator, meaning I work with conflicts and resolving conflicts. So based on that experience and also the theories of mediation and conciliation, this is what we are using in this toolbox. It is still work in the progress because we started the project last year, but then, as you know, with the corona, we have been set back a bit by not being able to do our master classes and our trainings and our feedback sessions and such. So what you're getting here is the early stage presentation of what the Bridge Building Toolbox is all about. So you might know Constructive Institute in Denmark that was founded in 2017 by Ulrik Hårup and Ole Borg. Ulrik is the CEO and Ole is a very distinguished journalist who is now head of the fellowship program, where this year 10 journalists will be joining us and being funded, and they then have close to 1 year where they can just dig into constructive journalism and get it under the skin and into their practice. And for those of you who do not know Constructive Institute that much, if you don't, I'll just quickly say that it is the green column in the graphic that shows that their take on constructive journalism is that you are not looking at now or yesterday, you're looking at tomorrow. You are here to, as a journalist, to inspire and understand what to do now. How can we solve this? How can we move on? You have a more curious approach rather than critical and dramatic. You are not here to judge anyone. You're not here to be a police officer. You're here to facilitate the readers and the parties involved in the story in moving forward. What now? How to move forward? And the focus is on solution and best practices. So that is what constructive journalism is all about. So when we now look at the bridge building toolbox, you will see that it fits within the green column. But regarding finding solution and best practices, that is something we will work with the parties in having the parties to come up with. It is not necessarily the journalist's role, and that is also not how most journalists see themselves, to be the creator solutions and change society by being the ones bringing ideas to the table, but they rather, most of them see themselves as someone who can see themselves help the parties involved in the stories to be more adaptable and more creative towards finding solutions. So the journalist will not be the one proposing solutions, but will be the one who will increase the quality of the dialogue between the parties involved, so that when the quality enhances, also very often the creativity of the parties enhances. So when we move on in the slideshow, which I'm doing here, first of all, when we define conflict, if we take a simple definition of conflict from the Cambridge Dictionary, it says it's an active disagreement between people with opposing opinions or principles. Now, active disagreement means that just because I do not agree with you, we don't necessarily have a conflict, but an active disagreement is where I have an opposing view and I'm here to try to enforce that upon you, or I'm here to use my disagreement actively to prevent you from doing something or getting you to change your opinion. So, for instance, I do not have a conflict with Donald Trump just because I disagree with him, because I do not have an active engagement with him. I cannot prevent him from having his opinion. He cannot prevent me from having my opinion. So a conflict is where we have this active disagreement. Now, one of the mediation practices that we have looked into that we found was a bit more adaptable into the journalistic practice is the specific mediation practice called the transformative mediation. It is not the method that is used by most mediators. Most mediators are facilitative mediators, where they have a structure and they guide the parties and they set rules and boundaries and they take the parties through various steps of a traditional conflict resolution. The transformative mediation approach is very different, to say the least. They view conflict as a crisis in human interaction and in human communication, meaning that if we have a conflict, it is very often because the conversation we're having, the communication we're having is suffering from a crisis. So we have taken some of the methods from the transformative mediation and seen how can we integrate this into the journalistic practice. And on the screen, you can also see a classic way of conflict escalating, where you have the disagreement and then it turns into personification and it can escalate up the ladder. And what we very often see is that, unfortunately, in order to sell clicks, in order to sell news and sell stories, very often the journalist actually unintentionally or intentionally comes to play the role of getting the conflict to a polarization. That is, to highlight the conflict in a manner that is not necessarily where the conflict is, but it's where the conflict is most sellable. So a lot of journalists, they see themselves as someone who is just documenting the story. So I'm not taking part with any of the parties. I'm not interfering. I'm just here to document. I'm here to take photos, so to speak. I'm just reporting what is happening. And then very often we also see journalists saying, well, I'm not here to intervene. I'm just here to take the photo or explain the story as it is. I'm not here to, in this picture, save the baby. I'm just here to say this is how things are. However, very often, as you know, a journalist do make some choices in how to present stories, how to interview people, who to interview, and that very often actually turns out to become a story that is not necessarily the objective picture of the situation, but also very often a very subjective angling of the story based on the journalist involved and the parties that has been chosen for the interview. And what we see very often is that, unfortunately, when it comes to covering conflicts, because the journalists want to sell clicks, or the media they're working for wants to sell newspapers or clicks or have more viewers, unfortunately, the tendency is that journalists very often are not only holding a microphone, but they are doing it in a way that is almost dynamite to the conflict. They are highlighting the differences, they are highlighting the disagreements, they are creating an atmosphere where two opposing parties might be here, but in fact they are presented like being further apart, because that makes the black and white more distinguished from or for the audience. And many will argue that, like in the Gladiator movie, that journalists are just entertaining people. We're just, are you not here to see conflict? This is not why you are here. So we have seen some media and some journalists say that, well, when we do debate programs, when we do a red and blue corner and we highlight the polarization, we highlight the situation more dramatically, we're doing this to entertain the audience. Of course, the problem is that you are actually creating the reality. You are the picture, you are the window to the viewers of your media. Their view on the world is through the media very often. So we need to be very careful on which frames we set as a journalist. I found in this 2007 article that was called News Media as Mediators by Carol Pauli, where she says that news coverage rarely offers parties the sustained engagement that can be essential to resolving conflicts. And they did a little research where they say that the reporter generally frames issues later in the process of writing or telling the story. Here, the contrast to neutral framing of mediation is stark. An analysis of 7 newspapers over a 2-month period found that 30% of front-page stories used combative narrative frames. That is, they told stories in terms of conflicts, winners and losers, or revelations of wrongdoing. So it is very well known that, unfortunately, the headlines and the angles of stories are more dramatic, more polarized than maybe even the reality is. So in this article, they also share this example of how Cronkite, a former news interviewer, or news anchor, he did an interview with Sadat, the former Egyptian president or prime minister, where he had a conflict with Mr. Begin, who was the prime minister of Israel. And in an interview, Sadat is saying, I'm just waiting for the proper invitation. And Cronkite here, instead of just saying, okay, so you have not received an invitation, he engaging it by rephrasing it to clarify. So he says, you must get something directly from Mr. Begin and not through the press. And so Sadat says, right. And Cronkite says, and how would that be transmitted since you do not have diplomatic relations with Israel? And Sadat says, why not through our mutual friend, that is the Americans? And then Cronkite says, so if you get a formal invitation, how soon will you be prepared to go and meet Mr. Begin? And he says, in the earliest time possible. And Cronkite says, within a week. And he says, yes. So this is just an example of how a journalist is working actually in the green column of the constructive journalism, where he looks at what now, what can be done, how can we get you two to meet each other. He's not necessarily suggesting what to do, he's just asking what needs to be done tomorrow in order to get this process moving on. So it is not because we are going at Constructive Institute, we want to change the world completely or change the way journalism is conducted completely. But we want to, together with all the other interesting branches of solution-oriented journalism and conciliatory journalism, we just want to bring tools to the table that can give different ways of covering and working with conflicting parties in a way that will give a more sustainable democracy rather than this tainted and overemphasized polarization. So the bridge building toolbox in itself look like this. From the transformative mediation method, we know that empowerment is very important, and we know that recognition is very important. So the goal of the bridge building toolbox is to provide tools that can help the journalist get the parties to feel more empowered in the conversation, to have more recognition towards each other, and from enhancing the empowerment and enhancing the recognition, parties are very often much more likely to be able to accept the conflict and the situation, and if they want to, seek out constructive solutions. So the reason we call this a bridge building toolbox is because we took this picture of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and we actually say, well, first of all, when you're building a bridge, you need to have the pylons done first. Those are the foundation for the future building of the bridge. If the parties engaged in the conflict are not feeling empowered, but are feeling disempowered and losing trust and not feeling strong enough to actually be constructive in a dialogue, you will have no constructive dialogue. So just as building a bridge, the foundation of a pylon, empowerment is very crucial. Second, before you can actually build the road that goes that brings the bridge together, you actually need to build the arch after you have built the pylons. So the pylon here is the foundation, and then the connection is the recognition that the parties in the conflict start to recognize each other. Okay, we might have different viewpoints, we might have different experiences of the situation, but I can see you have a point, I can see you have a different expectation, you have a different experience, whatever. That recognition is the second part of being capable of accepting the situation as it is, and or moving forward to actually building the road of finding a constructive solution. So the reason we have these three elements is because the transformative mediation, who was coined by Robert Baruch and Joseph P. Folger, they say that when we are in a conflict, we tend to start a downward going spiral. We become more negative, destructive. We tend to alienate the other party and demonize them. And in that process, we actually ourselves become weak, because the reason we're doing this is because we do not have the surplus energy to be able to recognize the other party. We become more self-absorbed. We find allies that can prove that we are okay as we are, and the other party is the wrongdoing. So actually, as a conflict escalates, we actually feel more and more disempowered, and we become more and more self-absorbed, being less capable of recognizing other people. However, if we start to enhance our empowerment and we feel stronger, not stronger physically, but stronger mentally, we also start to become more relaxed and be open to be more responsive to other people. And by that, the recognition starts to increase. And once we feel comfortable, we feel empowered, we have increased recognition. Once we are in that personal state of mind and state of activity, we start to be more humanizing, more connecting. We can be more positive and constructive. And that is actually the two things needed in order to be able to get to constructive solutions or to accept differences without turning into violence. But very often, unfortunately, very often, the way conflicts are covered are instead, as shown in the bottom of the screen, that the journalist is almost putting wood on the fire, or in this case, bringing dynamite into the situation. And that is what we want to avoid. So as I said, this is work in progress. The toolbox is work in progress. But what we are trying to do and working with right now is to take some of the elements from transformative mediation and see how could a journalist use this in practice. We want this to be very practical oriented. The three most important things a transformative mediator does when he or she tries to enhance the conversation between two parties that are in conflict is that they do reflection one-to-one. This is not rocket science, but it is actually a method where when a party has stated how they see the situation, you do a one-to-one reflection to them. This gives them, first of all, the feeling that they have been heard. And when you feel heard, your recognition starts to increase. You feel more recognized, but you also feel more empowered that you actually have a voice and it has been heard one-to-one. And it also gives the party an opportunity to increase the verbal content. If they say, well, I don't like the other party, and you say, so you don't like the other party, they have the opportunity to say, well, actually, I hate the other party. But very often they will also lower their verbal content by saying, well, like, yeah, well, I'm not satisfied with the other party. Meaning they start using a less conflicting verbal wording because they feel heard. And as they feel heard, they don't need to use such a strong language any longer. Then we also use a summary, which is when the parties have had back and forth, you summarize what they have been talking about. But the key here is actually that you summarize the conflict. You don't necessarily summarize all the parts where you agree and stuff like that, because that is what traditional facilitative mediators are doing. Here we are actually focusing primarily on where the conflict is, summarizing where they disagree. And then the third point is to do the check-in, where you start to ask the parties, what would you like to do now? You do not have a forced structure of saying, now we go into this or this or this. You just say, where would you like to go right now? And leave the power and the responsibility with the parties, because they are grown-ups, they have brains, they have opportunities, they have all the tools within them. But the more downward spiraling they are, the less access they have to the tools. So when we do the check-in, very often a party will say, well, I think we should have a better conversation about this, or I think we should meet and talk about how to solve this, or whatever. And maybe it just becomes silent. But very often the parties will themselves start to see where do they want to go now, because as we do the reflection and we do the summary, it is very simple tools, but they are so effective in getting people to calm down, feel more empowered than disempowered, feeling more recognized, giving more recognition. And when you are empowered and you feel recognized and you give recognition, the human nature will very often be inclined to engage in a better dialogue towards solving the conflict. The more disempowered you become, the more unrecognized you feel, the more self-absorbed, weak, and protective you will become. And then we are optionally, and this is very optionally, working with thinking about whether or not we should include some tools for brainstorming sessions. The reason that this is very optional is because, as I said, most journalists see it to be completely without the scope of journalism to have any role in creating solutions and facilitating, like having a whiteboard and coming up with solutions and stuff like that. We know it is very useful in some mediation methods, but we find that maybe journalism and the role of journalism, we will have a lot of journalists who will say, this is a no-go for me. I will not go into that part of it. So when we finalize the toolbox, and I'm finished in a moment here, when we finalize this toolbox, we will probably make an optional toolbox in the toolbox regarding how to do brainstorming, but also focus primarily on the reflection, summary, and check-in, and how to do it in interviews live, how to do it in written stories where you have more time, how to do it in debate programs, because the way you will use reflection, summary, and check-in will be different. So that is what we're going to work with for the next couple of years, and we're going to do some tryouts, try different formats, see how it works, refine the toolbox, and then hopefully be able to provide a toolbox at the end of or middle of 22 perhaps, where the tools have been tested more and more precisely within various formats of the journalistic practice. So that's what we're here to talk about today. We can talk, we can practice, because we all know that knowing what to do is simply not enough. We need to put our knowledge into practice. So the mic is open for discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Mikkel. I'm suggesting if we have